McNEILL, qui est professeur d'addictologie au King's College de Londres et qui a coécrit à la fois le rapport du Public Health England de l'été dernier et aussi le rapport du Royal College of Physicians d'il y a 15 jours. C'est un honneur pour moi d'accueillir Anne, à la fois en tant que collaboratrice, ça fait longtemps qu'on travaille ensemble, et comme amie. Et donc, je voudrais lui laisser maintenant la parole.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much, Jack, for inviting me to speak at this really important conference. I have no competing interests to declare. My funding comes from the public and voluntary sectors. So this is a summary of what I'm going to talk about. Throughout my talk, I'm going to draw on the two reports that Jack mentioned, the importance of separating the drug from the delivery system, and then talk about some of the concerns about the use of e-cigarettes and describe the patterns of use in the UK. So here you can see the two reports. The one on the left, which is commonly referred to as the PHE, or Public Health England report, we were commissioned to write an update of the evidence on e-cigarettes. And this was published in August last year, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. And then on the right-hand side is the report that was published just 2 weeks ago by the Royal College of Physicians Tobacco Advisory Group, of which I'm a member, so that's hot off the press. And alongside that, we published an editorial in the British Medical Journal, summarising the report. So Professor Michael Russell, who you've already heard about from Jean-François, was my head of department when I started my tobacco control research career. And he was really ahead of his time in talking about the need to separate nicotine from tobacco. So you've already seen this quote from Jean-François here at the bottom, that smokers smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. So it's really important to separate the nicotine, so that's the nicotine molecule, from the tobacco smoke, because if we can do that, it will have a marked reduction on the mortality and morbidity caused by smoking in society. So in 1991, Mike Russell produced a seminal paper where he talked about that it was not so much the efficacy of new nicotine delivery systems as temporary aids to cessation, but their potential as long-term alternatives for tobacco that made the virtual elimination of tobacco a realistic future target. So in other words, it's possible now that cigarettes, as we know them, could become obsolete in our lifetime, and that really wasn't possible a few decades ago. So let's have a look at the comparative health risks between cigarette smoke on the one side and nicotine on the other. So I think we all know that there are over 7,000 different chemicals in cigarette smoke. Around 70 are known carcinogens, and many hundreds of others are toxic. On the other side, nicotine is just one chemical. Now, yes, it is the chemical that causes addiction, so it has neuroadaptive effects on the brain. And at very high levels, it can be fatal, so more than 500 milligrams. But when we take a look at the different diseases that are the main causes of death and disease from cigarette smokes, we see a very sharp comparison. So first, if we look at addictiveness, it is correct that nicotine causes people to smoke, but the addictiveness of nicotine varies depending on two factors. First, the dose, and then secondly, the speed with which it is delivered. And I would add another one, it also depends on what comes along with it. So cigarettes have been very highly engineered to maximize the addiction of nicotine. Whereas something like the nicotine patch is a much slower and lower form of nicotine delivery, so it's not so addictive. When we look at the main categories of disease, you can see that although, for example, with cancers there's a theoretical risk, there is yet no evidence that nicotine causes cancer in humans. And you can see, as you go down, some of the other risks. Nicotine is a toxin in pregnancy, but it's unclear what proportion of the reproductive effects of cigarette smoking are caused by nicotine. But I think you've seen something like this previously. This slide shows what proportion of smokers and ex-smokers believe that nicotine doesn't cause cancer, which is the right answer. And as you can see, only around half, 50% or less, get the answer correct. And the 4 different colours are across 4 different countries, and you can see they're remarkably consistent. So I see this as a failure of those of us working in this field not to have communicated the difference between nicotine and the other constituents of cigarette smoke. And I think it's probably very similar in France. But I've been talking about individual risks of using this product compared with smoking. What about the population risks? Because these are concerns that people have raised. And these are really threefold. That e-cigarettes could attract new users who then start smoking, so they call it a gateway effect. That smokers could switch rather than stopping smoking, so this is dual users. And then thirdly, the ex-smokers could take up the products and then relapse. To me, the greatest evidence of that would be if we saw smoking prevalence in societies increasing. That's how we would know whether these risks are true. However, we know that that is difficult because other interventions also influence smoking prevalence. So, for example, that happened in France when the price was lowered, smoking prevalence went up. So it's not an exact science, but we would have an idea by looking at smoking prevalence. Okay, this graph is quite complicated. It's quite old, from 2001, and it was drawn by Lynn Kozlowski, who's already been mentioned. But I think it's very important. What it shows along the bottom is the decrease in danger of different products, and then up the side is how many times you'd need to multiply the proportion of users in society to have an equal risk. So to give one example, where the green circle is, if you have a product that's 95% less harmful than smoking, which is our estimate for e-cigarettes, as I'll come on to show, then you would have to multiply the proportion of people currently smoking in society 20 times to have an equal risk. Now, in England at the moment, we have about 1 in 5, 20% of people who are smoking. You cannot multiply that 20 times. So what that means is that if everyone, for example, took up e-cigarettes in society and no one smoked, we'd still be much better off in public health terms. Now, I want to say I am not promoting that. I'm not suggesting that we want people to take up e-cigarettes. What I'm just saying is that underscores how uniquely dangerous cigarette smoking is. So now what we have is a continuum of harm of nicotine products. At the left-hand end, as Jean-Francois was saying, the combustible products, which are highly dangerous, equivalent to the dirty syringe in drug addiction. We would like people to quit nicotine use altogether, but if they can't, there is now available to people a variety of products which aren't combustible and so are much less harmful than cigarette smoking. Okay, so we're mainly here today to talk about electronic cigarettes. I don't need to go into these because we've already introduced them. And we started studying them in the UK a few years ago when we started to notice that they were becoming very popular in society. And this pie chart here is just showing the many different varieties of e-cigarettes that were on the market in 2013 when that paper was written. But when we were doing our research for the PHE report, one of the things we became aware of is that people's perceptions of relative risks were going in the wrong direction. So you've had some presentation earlier giving these figures, but what we were seeing is that people were increasingly believing that e-cigarettes were equally harmful to cigarette smoking, which of course is wrong. And this was a national survey that we carried out, remarkably similar results from a survey that Action on Smoking and Health carried out. And these were both of adults. We got similar results with young people. And so that's why in the PHE report, we decided that we should try to explain better what the relative risks of smoking tobacco cigarettes compared with e-cigarettes was. So you've already seen this diagram down the left-hand side, and down the right-hand side was our assessment of e-cigarette vapor. We believe that the addictiveness varies depending on the type of e-cigarette, but the constituents of cigarette smoke that harm health, including those 70 carcinogens, are either absent or, if they were present at very low levels, mostly below 5% of the doses in cigarette smoking. And the main chemicals present in e-cigarettes, like propylene glycol and glycerin, had not been associated with any serious risk. So we concluded that they were less than 95% as harmful as cigarette smoking. And this figure was substantiated in the Royal College of Physicians report just recently, and there is a chapter on that in the report. So just to then move to the population risks, this slide looks at children using e-cigarettes in the UK, and the different coloured bars are because we've used different surveys. So if you look at the three sets of bars on the left-hand side first, you can see that children are experimenting with e-cigarettes. Around 10% said that they have ever tried. But when you move to the second and the third sets of bars, so looking at more than weekly, it's 1% or less who are using e-cigarettes with any regularity. And then if you look to the final two sets of bars, those two sets of bars are among never smokers. So you can see there is a little bit of experimentation, about 2% of never smokers who say they've tried e-cigarettes. But regular use is around 0.2%. So very, very few young people who are never smokers are using e-cigarettes in the UK. So most of the use is by those children who were already experimenting with tobacco cigarettes. And you can see that smoking prevalence among youth has continued to decline since e-cigarettes were introduced in 2011. So what about adults? So this is a graph from the toolkit, which Jean-Francois has already mentioned. It's run by Robert West and Jamie Brown. And you can see that e-cigarettes are now the most popular form of support used by smokers in the UK. Actually, the most popular form of support is to use nothing, but when people do use support, e-cigarettes are the most common. So what's been happening to our adult smoking prevalence? It's continued to decline since e-cigarettes were introduced. And again, using the smoking toolkit, which is done much more frequently, you can see adult smoking prevalence continuing to decline. And when you look at those who've stopped smoking in the past 12 months, that's been increasing since e-cigarettes came on the market. So I'm just going to show you a few slides so you can see the patterns of use of e-cigarettes compared with nicotine replacement therapy in the UK. And again, I'm drawing on Robert's Smoker's Toolkit. So the green bars in all these slides are e-cigarettes. The blue bars are nicotine replacement therapy. And you can see that e-cigarettes are more popular. This is among smokers and recent smokers. And you can see slightly more popular among women than men. The age distribution is a little bit different because we see more younger smokers using e-cigarettes than they did with nicotine replacement therapy. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing because traditionally we found young smokers quite hard to support and encourage to stop smoking. We're still seeing e-cigarettes predominantly in our higher education groups, A, B, C1, but there is some penetration in the among the disadvantaged smokers. But this is a slide I just want to pause on for a minute. This is about dual use. So this shows the proportion of e-cigarette users and NRT users, nicotine replacement therapy users, who also smoke. And you can see that the proportions are actually remarkably similar. So just to say a few words about dual use. Dual use is inevitable because e-cigarettes are not a magic bullet. You don't pick up an e-cigarette and stop smoking. Although actually a couple of vapers have told me that that's what they've done. On the whole, there is a period of experimentation alongside cigarette smoking. And the key message for me, for people who are dual using, is to encourage them to stop smoking as soon as possible, because that's the only time we're going to see the public health benefits maximized. We are seeing an increase in e-cigarettes among recent ex-smokers, which is because they're using e-cigarettes to try to stop. And we are seeing a little increase in long-term ex-smokers as well. But we're not seeing, on those two bottom lines, an increase in use by never smokers. And what we're beginning to see in the UK is a separation now of nicotine use from cigarette smoking use. And bearing in mind what I said earlier about the relative harmfulness, that will have a public health, should have a marked public health impact. So just to summarize, we found evidence that electronic cigarettes are not causing young people to take up smoking, that they can help people to quit smoking and reduce their consumption, even amongst people who weren't intending to quit. I haven't shown those data. So in summary, e-cigarettes weren't undermining the long-term declines in cigarette smoking that we've observed. Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to pose the question, why is it that e-cigarettes are so popular in comparison with other nicotine replacement products? And there's probably a variety of reasons. As I mentioned, there is the speed and dose of nicotine delivery, but also the packaging and the marketing. So we've seen some ads which are very reminiscent of the tobacco industry ads, with the very attractive people using them, and that you can use them in bed after you've had sex, etc., etc. But we're also seeing some different types of ads challenging you to, if you have friends who smoke, to say that, you know, rather than your friends smoking, encourage them to try to quit and encourage them to use e-cigarettes. There's also the behavioral aspects, of course, which are similar to cigarette smoking. And so to finish up with a couple of words again from Mike Russell, he said that nicotine use isn't to be presented as something good, but something as far less bad than cigarette smoking. And he said it's not proposed that it will be sufficient to grudgingly sanction long-term use, but that we have to promote them. The verb promote is used deliberately because they're not going to be as pleasant or as palatable as tobacco smoking. So in the Royal College of Physicians report, there is a chapter on how best to regulate them. And it's a difficult balance between trying to encourage smokers to use them while not encouraging youth to take them up. and at the same time trying to regulate them. So as Jean-Francois says, we can draw down the risks from 5% even lower, if that's correct, whilst encouraging smokers to use the products and having innovation in the market. So it's a fine balance to be used. These are the sorts of recommendations we made in our PHE report, which I don't think anybody in the room would disagree with. You know, if there's a smoker who's struggling to stop, then they should be encouraged to use e-cigarettes. And we were encouraging our stop smoking services to welcome them and offer them behavioral support, just like they would a nicotine replacement therapy user. So this is our conclusion from the RCP, that really we should be promoting the use of these products as widely as possible as a substitute for smoking, so that, as I said, perhaps in our lifetime we can see the end of the tobacco cigarette. And just in case you think we've lost our way in tobacco control in the UK, I just wanted to remind people that we are top of the leaderboard in terms of tobacco control in Europe, and the fact that we're introducing plain packaging, I think means that we'll be still high up when this is repeated. So we're not just going down a harm reduction route on its own, but we're doing it alongside a comprehensive tobacco control strategy. Thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge some of my colleagues, Debbie Robson, Leonie Brose, Sarah Hitchman from our group, and Jamie and Robert for the toolkit slides. Thank you very much.
Just a question. How the PHE report is an official report, governmental report or non-governmental report? Because we have the discussion in France, what says the Ministry of Health? But your recommendations are from Ministry of Health or for body we are near the Ministry of Health, but we are not the Ministry of Health. And what is Public Health England for French
It's a government agency, so it was a government commissioned report. And on the back of it, the government has said that they would consider the report, as they're also looking at the RCP recommendations. And in fact, the Prime Minister has himself said that it is important that the relative harms of e-cigarettes are known and that people can be encouraged to use them rather than
it's the same thing than the Haut Conseil de Santé Publique in France. It was near the government, but it was not the government. So, okay, you agree, Jack?
C'est une agence sous l'égide du ministère.
Donc je suis un simple vapoteur, j'ai pu voir que la directive des produits du tabac a été transposée en Angleterre. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez au niveau de la transposition par rapport au texte? Est-ce que vous êtes globalement satisfaite? Est-ce qu'il y a certains points qui auraient pu être revus un petit peu plus à la baisse, un petit peu moins drastiques, comme par exemple d'inclure les fameux 2 ml au niveau des tanks? Est-ce que vous pensez que globalement cette directive a été elle n'a pas été traduite parce qu'elle était déjà en anglais, mais est-ce que vous pensez qu'elle a été globalement bien prise en compte au niveau des vapoteurs? Parce que j'ai pas eu la traduction, donc je ne sais pas si vous en avez parlé dans votre intervention. Si c'est le cas, excusez-moi.
Thank you. I can't answer for all the vapors in Great Britain, but my own comment is I believe the UK government has tried to transpose the directive in a way that perhaps minimises the responsibilities on e-cigarette manufacturers in terms of the reporting mechanisms, but they had to follow what the TPD, it's a directive, so we had to follow the regulations within that.
En fait, donc, la TPD a été transposée en Angleterre de sorte à ce qu'elle minimise l'impact que ça pourrait avoir sur l'industrie en fait, de la vape, mais ils étaient quand même bien obligés de l'appliquer.
I mean, I think we don't know what the impact of the directive will be. As I've said, it's important to have some regulations, I believe, that will minimize the harmfulness of the products without discouraging innovation and over-regulation, as I think we've seen in the US with the FDA deeming regulations. What I do hope is that they will continue to monitor well, not continue, but they will monitor carefully the impact so that they can correct them if there are any unintended consequences, like people going back to smoking.
Merci Anne. Merci Anne pour cette présentation claire. Oui, Yvan Berlin. J'ai deux questions. La première, est-ce que tu as des données prospectives épidémiologiques suivies de cohortes, pas des études cross-sectionnelles en parents, c'est-à-dire une grosse cohorte qui est suivie sur plusieurs années pour voir deux choses. Premièrement, la probabilité d'arrêt, la probabilité de dual use, c'est-à-dire fumer avec, et surtout, sur une période plus longue, maintenant on a un recul quand même de quelques années, les correspondants outcomes de santé, c'est-à-dire le nombre d'événements de santé à n'importe quel niveau, que ce soit cardiovasculaire ou autre, des événements de santé pour démontrer effectivement qu'il y a une réduction de risque et pas rester au niveau spéculation, parce qu'on n'a pas de données pour dire. Le recul est suffisant et vous avez le toolkit qui permettra de suivre des milliers de personnes tout au long de plusieurs années. Merci.
Okay. Thank you, Ivan. It's true that we don't have very long-term data, but we do have data from a few years' use, and also we know what's in the products and what comes out of the products compared to cigarette smoke, and we have also some short-term studies of the health risks.
Do you have these data?
Yeah, so, I mean, these data are in the RCP report in detail, so I suggest to take a look at that. We also have evidence in terms of people quitting smoking. There is a Cochrane review which looked at the 2 randomized control trials thus far. And we've also carried out studies ourselves, as you know, where we've looked at people who are dual users over a period of time. And one of the things that we found, which I think is important to emphasize, is that we shouldn't just put all e-cigarettes together, because one of the papers that we found showed that the tank models, when used regularly, were more likely to be associated with stopping smoking than the cigalikes. But I think it's very hard to, if dual users aren't getting a clear message to stop smoking very quickly, then we can't expect them to stop. So I think it's really important that we do give those kind of clear messages out.
Merci beaucoup, Anne. Thank you very much. Merci, Marianne.